Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, a Mexican-born journalist living, working in Mexico City, staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth, who actually just was on a special program last night talking about the debate, which is one of the topics we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to the show, Kurt.
Thank you very much, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico, ready for another, and this is going to be a very interesting episode of Soberanía.
Excellent, yeah. So we're actually going to start talking about Norma Piña, the president of the Supreme Court of Mexico, before we get into the talk around the debate, which obviously the last and final debate happened last night here in Mexico City. Lots to say there. But we wanted to start talking about this very, very controversial case. Once again, the president of the Supreme Court making headlines here in Mexico. And, well, it looks like she's been busy engaging in a lot of behavior that is not becoming of her office, to say the least, but I will also say that is perhaps indicative of who are the actual authoritarians in this country, which is a conversation that happens a lot. But Kurt, maybe you can bring us up to speed while I get the story up here on the screen.
So, I think we've all had, the situation where, we're probably not in the best of mindsets and it's late at night. Maybe we've had something to drink and we just have that urge to maybe get out the cell phone and WhatsApp somebody. Don't do it. Especially don't do it if you're the head of Mexico's Supreme Court, who has a history of late night anger tweeting, or in this case, anger WhatsApping. No, rather. Right? In this case, it has to do with actually a very, jokes aside, a very serious matter, which has to do with the violation of, the separation of powers, right? Norma Piña, who has, openly said that, basically openly declared herself to be a member of the opposition faction, right? She said that Alito Moreno, the president of the PRI, is my friend and ally, right? And that'll be important in a second when I get to that, right? So she's openly declared herself to be a member of the opposition faction, not, an objective judge by any stretch of the imagination, was pressuring magistrates from the Electoral Tribunal. There were 3 magistrates who were trying to get this guy on the screen, Reyes Rodríguez Mondragón, to resign for his poor handling of the Electoral Tribunal. This is a Calderonista, a very conservative ally of Felipe Calderón. 3 magistrates were trying to, get him off, right? They didn't go to his, what do we call that? His presentation, right? His kind of state of the court address there. Yep. Just don't forget to get your mic on there, José Luis. So Piña started to pressure these people, right? Because it's important to have a conservative leading the Electoral Tribunal and the lead up to this election in 2 weeks, right? As we've talked about in previous episodes, Mexico's system is very different from the U.S., where you have 50 secretaries of states qualifying state elections. Here you have one federal electoral tribunal who has significant powers to either validate or annul any election, right, including this one that's going to happen in 2 weeks. And we've talked amply about the fact that because the opposition knows they're going to lose and lose badly, they're going to switch, they've already switched to a legal juridical strategy in which the Electoral Tribunal is going to be key in this, to say that, so-and-so rules were violated, there was violence, there was this, there was that, there weren't fair elections, it was an election of state. It's the Electoral Tribunal that's going to decide this. So Norma Piña, knowing this months ago, of course, was trying to make sure that Reyes Rodríguez Mondragón was not removed. She was unsuccessful in this. Reyes Rodríguez eventually, resigned as head of the tribunal. She was upset, and started doing her late night WhatsApping. But then the next step was she organized a dinner with these dissident magistrates and Alito Moreno, the head of the PRI, to kind of, mend the fences there and be all friends again. Remember, we're all part of the same conservative faction here. As I tweeted, this would be basically, right, as if, John Roberts from the U.S. Supreme Court were hanging out weeks from the election and a dinner with Mitch McConnell and, all of the secretaries of state from the U.S. swing states. To having a chummy dinner, right, with Mitch McConnell and the secretaries of state from, insert your favorite swing state, right? Michigan, North
Ohio.
Carolina, Georgia, right? All of these, right? The few states that are going to swing the election. Imagine the outrage in MSNBC, CNN circles if that would have come out. Right? Imagine the outrage. There's already outrage about what's going on with, with Clarence Thomas and his, conflicts of interest, justifiably so. But imagine if this had happened.
Yep.
But this happens in Mexico, and nobody mentions this in the U.S. press. Nobody. Nothing. Crickets. Zero.
Even here in Mexico, there has been so little coverage of this issue. And it's deliberate. It's obviously because they realize this is a colossal mistake by Norma Piña. She has really, really committed an error on this one. There's a couple points that I wanted to make here, which is, one, I think it's no small thing. The electoral tribunal in Mexico is all powerful. If they annul the election, that's it. There is no other recourse. I mean, I don't imagine that actually happening, but let's assume that they do. They see that Claudia Sheinbaum wins an election on a landslide. Maybe Xóchitl Gálvez is relegated to, third place. Who knows? But let's say it's that scenario. And because of their conspiracy behind the scenes to try to basically affect the end result of the election, and they annul it, right? That's it. There's no more. There is no recourse. That this would be a new scenario where there would have to be street mobilizations, there would likely be violence. It would be a nightmare scenario for this country. So it's no small thing that Norma Piña, like you said, a declared ally of the opposition, of the old regime, I think more appropriately,
and the most
intervening in order to
corrupt,
have...
rancid part of it, Alito Moreno is, the former governor of Campeche, just swimming in corruption. I mean, we could do a whole show on that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Trying to influence the electoral tribunal so that she has her key actors in place, loses that struggle, and then holds this meeting. And it's been interesting because the defense has been, well, this is normal. Well, the president of the Supreme Court needs to maintain a dialogue with other political actors in the other branches of government. But here's a couple of things about why that defense doesn't really hold up. One, if it was such a normal thing, why was it done in secret? Why did it take a report from an investigative journalist at Millennium? We should mention that. This was published by Salvador Frausto. He did the work of figuring this out. Credit to him and the team over at Millennium for finding out what was going on here. Why did it have to come out this way, through press reports, right? It's very suspicious that you would engage in this kind of secret meetings with political actors. And apparently it turns out that even the people who were attending had no idea that somebody like Alito Moreno, the head of the PRI, was going to be there. And that Santiago Creel, although he did not attend, was invited. So this was clearly a meeting to conspire together with the old regime on the eve of an election. Just absolutely extraordinary. And the kind of thing that should rightfully destroy whatever kind of credibility Norma Piña has. Because she says, well, no, I'm just defending the Constitution. My job is to strive for a balance of power. But really, this actually speaks to everything we've talked about previously in this program, which is that what López Obrador's project represents. It represents a break with that old regime. It represents a new kind of direction towards a government that serves the majority. And this cúpula, this cabal of people who once benefited in every way imaginable, like we did in our last episode, looking at the way they even try to exploit the state-owned companies and suck money out of it for their own personal enrichment. They're very useless, and they're very offended that the things aren't working out this way, and therefore that's why they're working to try to prevent Morena from being able to continue with its political program.
And, the thing is here, with regards to the hypocrisy of the media, how many articles have there been? We're going to see another one at the end of this program. How many articles have there been that AMLO is authoritarian, that democracy in Mexico is at risk, right? This whole, tired litany, Mexico's young democracy is backpedaling and all this blah, blah, things that we could now write in our sleep, right? For contract, hits, right? All of that, rios de tinta, as they say in Spanish, right? Rivers of ink, right? All these, conservative tears have been shed about this, right? About how AMLO's supposedly, bringing Mexico's young, strapping democracy to its knees and all this. And here you have an openly declared Supreme Court justice, the head of the Supreme Court, meeting in secret with the head of the opposition in an attempt to keep a conservative head of, or at least conservative control of the electoral tribunal that's going to decide the election. I mean, just imagine the hypocrisy there, right?
I mean,
and
if
this
the
is why you can't
charges-
believe what the English media tells you. You cannot. And what they don't tell you.
Exactly. I mean, and they'll tell you that the authoritarian is López Obrador. They'll tell you that López Obrador is the one who is interfering with the other branches of government and reducing judicial independence, et cetera, et cetera. This is far more egregious than anything López Obrador has ever done, right? We talked about how the former president of the Supreme Court, who's actually being persecuted by the current Supreme Court president, Zaldívar, did the right thing. He's like, I want to dive into politics. So I'm going to resign my seat and I'm going to join the campaign in a formal way. That's the way it should be done. What we have, on the other hand, is somebody using their office to engage in partisan political action, right? And, it's a behavior that I think is actually really unbecoming of the office, right? There should be some sense of respect for occupying the presidency of the Supreme Court. You are the representative of the judicial branch of government. But this isn't even the first time that she's gone on this rage WhatsApping, right? And clearly hasn't learned her lesson. This is from last year, where one of the senators from Morena, Armenta, published some information.
Next governor of Puebla.
Yes.
Yep.
He published some information about some of the privileges that the judicial branch enjoys. That we've talked about before, sort of the gilded bureaucracy, the lavish expenses, the golden bureaucracy that enjoys all these privileges, life insurance, private health insurance, special payouts, et cetera, et cetera. And so he put this out, and she sends one of her advisors to get his phone number, and then only to send these threatening, kind of odd, to be honest, messages where she kind of makes allusions to, his behavior, but also like, are you willing to look at your children's in the eye? We have a copy of the transcript of the actual messages that were sent, right? And he basically at one point says, is this why you wrote to me? Just to like make fun of me? And then just kind of goes, buenas noches. It's a kind of, messages that you would expect from somebody who maybe has had a few too many in the night and decides to let out their emotions and regrets it the next day. Although apparently not in her case.
Yeah, because the next day she put out a letter defending it. Once those WhatsApps were leaked. Armenta was, I think, the acting president of the Senate at that point.
Yes.
Right? So you have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court anger WhatsApping, right? There's the whole string right here.
Yeah.
One of the high officials of the Senate, at night, saying, "Can you look your kids in the face?"
Yeah.
And he's saying, "Are you threatening me?" And then she ends with this kind of grandiloquent, history will judge, right? We've talked about, in other episodes, the kind of ridiculous grandiloquence of the Mexican conservative caste, right? Amusing, right?
I mean, for those of us who are only listening, it's extraordinary. We have these images on the screen here, and it's just kind of like this to and fro between the two of them. But I find it almost hard to believe that quite literally responds with a series of 6 laughing face emojis to his comments. Like, who do you think you are? Like, who do you like? You're representing the entire judicial branch, and this is the way you're communicating with the head of another branch, the legislative branch. It's just absolutely extraordinary. But
it's
it
like
speaks
you were
to
part
who
of
she is.
Mean Girls or something.
Yeah.
Like that level,
Yes. Yeah, she probably has the burn book in her office, right? Writing all the people that she hates and the reasons why. Right? But I think the reason we bring it up, it's not just about making fun of Norma Piña, although that's a great exercise. It's that it speaks to who she is. It speaks to this mentality that they are beyond any kind of criticism. They can say and do whatever they like. And then that is very much the attitude of the old regime. And that why there is so much resentment towards Morena and this government, and why they're even flirting with this idea of overturning the election, because they feel like they are entitled to behave this way, to do what they like, to get rich off of the state, to the detriment of the majority of this population, et cetera, et cetera. And then I want to move on to quite an interesting case, because we've called her the worst, Mexico's worst political analyst. I think you stepped it up last week, calling it the galaxy's worst political analyst, Denise Dresser.
Yeah, I've sent out some feelers to the rest of the galaxy. Dresser is the worst.
They agree. Good.
Yeah.
Good. She posits herself as as a fake progressive, as somebody who's just providing sensible analysis, but obviously has always been actually quite favorable towards the opposition, the right-wing National Action Party in particular. It's obvious where her political inclinations lie. Just read any of her analysis, which we'll get to a little bit later today. But even she sent a message on her Twitter account in response to this scandal saying the following, and I'll read it out and translate it for you. Huge mistake by Norma Piña to do politics with the magistrates from the electoral tribunal. Huge mistake sending message in that tone and to position herself that way. Huge mistake to organize a dinner with Alito Moreno. After the election, she should step down the presidency of the Supreme Court of the nation and return to her labor as a minister. Although her intentions may have been correct, unfortunately, what she's doing is damaging the institution. So in that case, Dresser almost sounds like us in this case, talking about the effect,
except
the
for that
tone she's
weird,
using, who she's
she had
meeting with.
the good intentions bit.
Except for
she
that
always has to screw it up at the end.
But it's extraordinary, right? That speaks to just how bad this is, and it actually is really disappointing how little coverage this has gotten, because it is pretty. But she deleted it.
Then she deletes the tweet, right? Didn't even have the courage of her convictions, right? The one time she actually, stepped out of her fake progressive, mode for 2 seconds, walks it back.
I don't wonder why. I wonder if she got maybe an unfriendly message from Norma Piña at 3 in the morning.
Right. 4
In
a.m.
fact, there was a Monero Hernandez. He made that comment, kind of poking fun at Denise Dresser, and then she accused him of being driven by moneyed interests. But, every time somebody does that, I think it's always a projection. You think we're all the same. You think that, for example, people like us will make criticisms of the opposition because Morena is paying us. We're not. This is a labor of love. This is a volunteer project. We're not motivated the way that they are for money. I remember very early in López Obrador's term, there was a comedian who did a satire of Denise Dresser. And she actually wrote to this comedian saying, how much do I need to pay you to get you to stop? Right? This is the way that they think. So the fact that she...
Humorless, self-important, arrogant. Yeah, we'll get back to this at the end of the article, right? And, here we are. The one time she does something, remotely respectable, nah. Delete it.
So I am going to share with you this video from last night's debate, which actually touches on this very issue. And I'm glad that it came up in the debate. I'm glad that this one. So we'll watch it.
I think it should have been harder on this, but let's listen.
Es la justicia. El problema es que ahora muchos ministros de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación se han extralimitado en sus funciones. Incluso han echado para atrás leyes que apoyan al pueblo de México y a la nación que han aprobado la Cámara de Diputados y la Cámara de Senadores. Y bueno, vamos a tener que decirlo, perdón, pero la presidenta de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, amagando a los magistrados del Tribunal Electoral para reunirse en lo oscurito con Alito, eso no es división de poderes. Lo que nosotros queremos es una Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, un poder judicial que responda a la nación y que responda a los intereses del pueblo de México y que haga su función y no se dedique a las politiquerías.
So there you have it. Just very briefly, what she does is talk about, towards the end there, saying that what we want is an independent judicial power that responds to the needs and the interests of the Mexican population, that doesn't fall victim to these political games. That talks about the division of powers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the reason I thought it was important for us to mention it here on the program is precisely because at least it made it into the debate, right? At least it's something that's now, maybe the mass media doesn't want to talk about it here in Mexico, but this is forcing it onto the agenda, forcing it into the part of the discussion, and making it a very important part of the discussion, because as we said previously, the accusation of Morena is that they're authoritarian, that they don't respect the division of powers, et cetera, when it's actually the opposition that has been engaging in this unscrupulous behavior.
Exactly, and this has been a perfect issue for Morena, really. We talked last week about Maria Amparo Casar, right, from the USAID-funded, supposedly anti-corruption organization, in her own corruption scandal with that massive pension, right? But this is another just classic instance. Right. This is why AMLO has talked about the need for a profound judicial, reform of the judicial branch. Right. Something that U.S. Democrats have, refused to do. Right. And let the U.S. Supreme Court trample all over, U.S. democracy as we know. Right. Here, right, Morena actually wants to do this. Right. Yeah. It has a large base of popular support for it. And right 2 weeks before the election, here's AMLO saying, "This is why.
This is why.
This is why." Right? And they, the conservatives don't even have the good sense to not get caught in these things. Right? To not get caught in these anger WhatsApping, or these, these private dinners, or these, fraudulent pension schemes, or whatever else. It's just, it's más fuerte que ellos. Right? The corruption is just, it's stronger than them. Right? They can't even control themselves. So they're just gifting topic after topic, issue after issue to the Morena coalition. Extraordinary. And
so while we're on the topic of the debate, why don't we get into it? So last night, like I mentioned at the beginning of the program, we had third and final debate for the presidential candidates here in Mexico. Overall, I would say that it kind of fulfilled my low expectations. I didn't think there was going to be a lot of noise. There wasn't going to be any kind of knockout punch, which they always talk about, happening at these debates. It was more of the same. I would argue that Xóchitl Gálvez probably did worse in this third one than she did in the second one. I would say that her worst was definitely the first one, followed by this last one, and then her best performance was the second debate. I think she looked overall fatigued. We mentioned this in the last program, right? She talked about how she's like, it's arduous work to be on the campaign trail, but I do it for you, right? I think she's clearly worn out. I think she's having a really bad time. I think the debate in particular really puts her in a position that she doesn't want to be in, being forced to have to defend the coalition that is indefensible, right? Every time that somebody mentioned that she's with the PAN or the PRI, she would turn to them and give them a scornful look, give them a stink eye. She was very, very, very clearly grumpy throughout the whole thing. Yeah. In fact, there were moments where, the camera was fixated on her, but it wasn't her turn, and you could see how she would realize she was on screen and then try to brighten up her smile, right? So I don't think the debate is really going to change much. I think, if anything, as usual, the person who's running a negative campaign is going to look badly by running negative attacks during the debate. She did the thing again, violating the rules, where she held up signs when she wasn't supposed to, accusing Claudia of being a liar. At one
point, they didn't stop her. The moderators didn't intervene this time.
I thought that was weird. I think once again the format was terrible, right? Yeah. You might as well just have an ordinary person reading the questions, because that's all the moderators do. I don't know why you have three of them on stage with them when they don't intervene. They don't press the candidates to actually respond to the questions. They don't point out the incongruities in their comments. In that sense, it was really disappointing. I thought they would maybe at least try to introduce a different format, considering the criticism of the first two debates for being so sterile, for not really having a role for the moderators. In all three debates, the only time a moderator actually intervened was Denise Merker in the first one, when she told Xóchitl Gálvez to try to actually answer the questions. I would have liked to have seen something like that. There was supposed to be a moment where there was like the candidates asking and having a direct interaction with each other. But of course, what ended up happening was the moderators read the question that the candidates had prepared for the other candidates, and it was just another excuse to go through the talking points.
I agree with you, José Luis. As often happens with the elite of Mexico, they look at the United States and they import kind of the worst element of something from the American model, right? And this was really the worst element of the U.S. Debate model, right? Last night was supposed to be some important topics, right? Security and safety, right? And foreign policy. And you really had after watching 2 hours, you get very little, right, more information as to, where to go in security policy and foreign policy, especially foreign policy.
And foreign policy is one of my personal favorites. That was the one I was looking forward to. I was like, okay, it was a handful. I liked Claudia's comment about citing Mario Benedetti and the need to look down to the south and things like that. But really, it was not a very enlightening discussion. And I was really looking forward to that part in particular. I ended up kind of tuning out because I was like, we're not really talking about anything in particular when it comes to foreign policy, right? Especially because there's been such a big shift under López Obrador of foreign policy, of a reorientation towards the global south, of a defense of sovereignty against the interests of U.S. imperialism, right? Et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that would have been good to get into, especially in contrast to the previous regime, which, as again, to remind you, it was Peña Nieto who joined the Lima group, which was this ad hoc group of Washington's allies trying to engage in regime change in Venezuela. It was Vicente Fox who famously told Fidel Castro, you can come to the dinner but leave, no? El comes y te vas, which is very infamous here in Mexico. Ask Xóchitl Gálvez to defend that. If you claim that you bring experience to this, your experience comes from the Fox years. Well, this is what foreign policy looked like then. Again, that didn't happen.
And here's why. Here's why. First of all, it's the format of the debate. In no reality can you articulate, a clear security and foreign policy program in 2 minutes or 1 minute, little blocks. You just can't. The format is against that, right? But the second thing is that Xóchitl Gálvez having two topics where she could have landed some blows, right? She could have landed some blows on, Morena's security policy. Although homicides are down 20%, it's still high, right? She could have landed some blows there, right? That, Morena hasn't come through on security policy. She could have talked about certain states where, Chiapas, where things are very, where there's just been assassinations of political candidates, right? And with regards to foreign policy, there was a lot that could have been said. Right, especially at a moment, where Mexico, as José Luis said, has a new orientation towards the south, but is also in this interesting balancing situation between the United States and China. Right, Mexico is benefiting from nearshoring and interest from China. China just launched its first direct flight to Mexico, not crossing through somewhere else. Right, just shows the interest that China has in Mexico. And AMLO's been careful to try to play one off against the other, right? Yeah. Telling the United States, we should integrate to, it'd be a bulwark against China. And basically telling China, no, is that we've got open doors here. We're not shutting off to you with tariffs like Biden is, right? Of course, the whole Gaza-Palestine issue, the International Criminal Court. There's so much that could have been discussed. If Galvez wanted to hit on, AMLO, she could have tried to hit on him for, all kinds of things about, intervening in South American policy when, supposedly the Estrada Doctrine forbids it. And, places like, Peru, Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, right? On one hand, there's this Estrada Doctrine that Mexico is neutral in foreign affairs, but, in areas that Mexico considers within its sphere of influence, and this is actually the best moments of AMLO, I would say, Mexico has really taken significant stands, right? This is all areas that Xóchitl Gálvez could have exploited. But instead of all of that, and having the topics very much in her favor, went on these scattershot attacks right? One after the other, after the other, after the other, just kind of jumping from one to the next with her posters and her, her kind of out of control graphics there. Again, going on this tired narco Claudia, narco AMLO bits. She accused the president of the party, Mario Delgado, to be in cahoots with the huachicoleros, the gasoline thievery there. But he said that he's under investigation in the United States, didn't do anything to back it up. She just went from one attack to the other, and then attacked Claudia Sheinbaum on her religion. So she didn't believe in God, right? And said, how dare you basically go and see the Pope wearing a skirt with the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is, of course, a Mexican national symbol, but you don't believe in it. You cannot believe in God, that's your right, but you shouldn't be using the symbol. Just kind of culture war nastiness.
I mean, let's call it what it is. It's a dog whistle. It's clearly an allusion to these kinds of senile tweets that Vicente Fox, her former mentor, was issuing a while back, that in fact led him to temporarily delete his Twitter account.
That's right.
Saying that she's a Bulgarian Jew, therefore the only real Mexican is Xóchitl Gálvez, and that's who they should vote for in the election, right? It's a racist dog whistle. It's the persecution of a religious ethnic minority in Mexico, right? It's the kind of thing that usually these, small L liberals, quote unquote progressives, get up all in arms about. But again, dead silence on this one, right? Like I have this one on the screen here, where precisely the moment you're mentioning, where she talks about how she wore an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe on a dress. You're allowed. You have all the right to not believe in God. That's a personal issue. That's what she says. What you don't have the right to is to use the religious beliefs of Mexicans for opportune political reasons. I thought that was a real low for Xóchitl Gálvez, right? And I think clearly is part of this whole strategy of going negative, attacking the rival instead. But she had a really rough time as well, because we always forget to mention him, but Jorge Álvarez Mañez once again had a pretty good night. He landed some pretty good blows on Xóchitl Gálvez. So she was kind of getting attacked from the left and from the right, quite literally. At one point, it was actually... if I'm not mistaken, you're not allowed to use a teleprompter. But she was clearly looking at something the entire time. Mm-hmm. And you can kind of tell when somebody's reading off of a screen, right? Mm-hmm. Again, not sure exactly what's going on there. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation for it, but it speaks to her lack of preparedness, the fact that she underperformed. Once again, it's a debate that's not really probably going to change any minds. If anything, Jorge Álvarez Mañez probably won some more votes to the detriment of Xóchitl Gálvez.
Yeah, Mañez, I think one of his best quote is, you're always saying that, you say to Claudia that, she's responsible for what AMLO did, and you say that I'm responsible for the governors of my party, right, Nuevo León and Jalisco, but you never take responsibility for the governments that you participated in, right? And you always say I'm my own person. Right, and that's obviously clearly true, right? And kind of these small details that you pointed out. Xóchitl spent most of the time looking off to the left, whether it was at a teleprompter or whether it was at the moderators. It's a mistake, because I tweeted about it. It's just she wasn't looking at you, the viewer. She was looking off screen the whole time. Whereas, as you can see here, Claudia Sheinbaum mastered the basics. And the basics is, look in the camera. You're looking at the viewer, right? This is my proposals to you, right? The Mexican public, not them. Yeah. Right? Which is why she didn't refuse to answer most of Xochitl's scattershot attacks, right?
She did have a great response to one of them, though. So we mentioned that Anabel Hernandez has this book, which is basically based on innuendo and hearsay, which the final chapter is dedicated to Claudia Sheinbaum, and she's trying to basically make that argument that we've unpacked here before, that Morena is aligned with organized crime and that there's been all kinds of illicit funding from organized crime groups, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there was a program where Xóchitl Gálvez participated, a talk show, where they're like, well, in the last debate, Xóchitl, you called her a narco candidate. And she tried to defend herself. She was like, well, Morena is tied with organized crime. He's like, but Sergio Sarmiento, who is no friend of the left, he is a libertarian right-winger, says, no. You said Claudia is a narco candidate. Why? And she's like, well, Anabel Hernandez's book talks about that. And he's like, but you didn't read it. She invented it. So maybe between then and that moment and last night, she finally read the book. And she cites it in the debate. But she doesn't cite documents. She doesn't cite the actual allegations coming from these anonymous sources.
I only read the last chapter, or I don't know.
She just read the last chapter. And you can actually tell because the book had bookmarked only at the end. And I think Claudia's response was quite good. She's like, this is your inventions. You want to read fiction? Why don't you read science fiction? Why don't you pick up a Ray Bradbury book?
Yeah.
But what's interesting about, for me, is some of the reaction, and it ties into what we were talking about at the beginning with Norma Piña, has been precisely this leveling of accusation. So, dear listeners, once again, I subjected myself to Latinos' roundtable discussing the election debate last night. And here's the thing that really jumped out.
Buy the man a coffee. We do this for you. Right? Again, so you don't have to.
So you don't have to. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, so we've talked about how they love to label Morena as authoritarian. And I'm trying to wrap my head around it because one of the things that they were criticizing was they're like, well, I'm so offended that Claudia would go out there and saying that they're the Democrats, that they're the ones who fought to democratize this country, et cetera, et cetera. They have a very twisted conception of what democracy actually looks like. And I think it was made clear as day. They said that the fact that Claudia refused to respond to Xóchitl Gálvez's unhinged attacks was a sign of her authoritarianism. That she doesn't even turn to look to Xóchitl Gálvez. But that's how they think. And it really kind of was a light bulb moment for me. They think democracy isn't the masses having a government that represents them. They think that democracy is that they have a voice. That this elite in society, the business, the commentators, the religious, the political elite, that they should be the privileged ones when it comes to the decisions being made by the government. That if you don't bother yourself to actually engage with them, you're an authoritarian. And that's their logic. And it speaks very highly. It's why Norma Piña thinks that she can send these rants at 3 a.m. on WhatsApp. Right? It's why these commentators think that Xóchitl Gálvez is the great savior, because she speaks to them. We're talking about un puñado de gente. We're talking about a very tiny group of people who think that their voice is the most important, that in fact should be more important than the voices of the 125, 26 million Mexicans in this country.
Yeah, so first of all, as if Claudia would be so dumb as to fall into their trap of spending the night responding to, one scattershot attack after another, right? As if she would be that dumb, right? But the second point is absolutely right? They're offended, right? And this isn't the first time they've mentioned that she won't even turn and look at me, right? It's not her job to turn and look at you, right? That's why the podiums are facing forward, right? That's why you're supposed to be speaking to the public, right? It was Xóchitl Gálvez that made the mistake of spending the night looking left, right? Looking, provocative and reactive, right? Instead of making proposals. What is her proposal on security? She had an hour to talk about that. Came up with very, very little.
Right? I didn't hear a single proposal from Xóchitl. Like, here's what I'm going to do when elected, if elected, right? In fact, that was another comment they made, because Claudia was talking about when I'm president, right? Which Xóchitl Gálvez does too. She's like, en mi gobierno, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. They're like, oh, she's already assuming that she's going to win. Yeah. She doesn't care about the actual result. But in fact, if you watch her interventions in the analysis shows following the debate, for example, she did one with Sin Embargo, her number one message was, go and vote. Voting is the most important thing. We need to win by a landslide. June 2nd, turn out, vote. Even if you think we're winning, go and vote. Right? Yeah. So this idea that it's just, a technicality to actually win the election is not even accurate in terms of her own outlook. But I thought she had, and I have this here on the screen, I'm not going to play it, but basically she says, you know what, Mexicans deserve something that isn't just slander. They deserve a debate that's actually about proposals.
That was good.
And I thought that was actually a really good response. It made her, once again, look presidential. which really matters in these debates. It's not even so much about who has the best ideas. It's who's convincing you that they deserve to occupy the office of the presidency. And when you have a woman who's scowling 90% of the time next to a woman with poise, who's
And holding
speaking
up
to the
like
camera,
Pinocchio signs, that, juvenile Pinocchio signs that she's not even supposed to be holding up, And especially in light of what we just talked about with Norma Piña, right? I think Claudia's call for a greater level of maturity in politics, I think, resonated. And I think our next topic is going to talk about just another area where Mexico's elite actually think they physically own the country.
yes,
Starting with Mexico's main square, the Zócalo, which they think is theirs.
So on Sunday, actually, in the morning, there was the third or fourth, the latest instance of the so-called pink wave, La Marea Rosa, which is an AstroTurf effort to portray opposition political groups as representing civil society, as a voice of the citizenry of Mexico, protesting against the authoritarian decline, against the alleged attacks against Mexico's electoral institutions, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, what did they do? They took off the mask and they openly made it a political rally featuring the candidate for the head of government here in Mexico City for the opposition, Santiago Taboada, and Xóchitl Gálvez, the candidate for presidency on behalf of the opposition. But in this case, they had, unfortunately, had to come to terms with the fact that the Zócalo belongs to everybody. And we had this very curious scene where you had the militant teachers organization, La Cente, who had actually previously arrived to the Zócalo to protest for higher wages and demand action from the federal government, left criticism of López Obrador. And it's very common for them to engage in the plantón tactic, which is the actual occupying of the physical space. And they said, well, we're going to share this. But of course, that did not sit too well with some people from the opposition. And we had some very troubling scenes from yesterday of, well, the sort of behavior you might expect from people who feel entitled that all of Mexico belongs to them. And you had a great tweet here speaking about this, so maybe you can jump in on it.
Yeah, so my tweet is, this happened very early on, in yesterday's event, right, where the teachers are occupying, not even all of the Zócalo, just part of it, around the flagpole and near National Palace. And the Marea Rosa comes in and they start scuffling and skirmishing with each other, right? And I put, walking disaster for Claudio X González and company. Aren't they the civil society? What are they doing fighting with the Cente, which is the teachers' union, right? The militant section of the teachers' union, right? The national teachers' union, right? And it's really something, right? Because what Claudio X González, who's, again, the USAID-funded, real power behind the throne of the opposition here, has constantly said over the last several years is, we don't represent political parties, right? Mm-hmm. We represent civil society. Civil society, right? And they always boast about how many of these civil society groups are, backing their events in the Zócalo, right? Including, neo-phalangist groups from the 1930s. But, we'll leave that aside. Right? Really. And so they always mention their civil society because that is the idea for them of what, the public is. It's not el pueblo, as López Obrador talks about. It's not the people because they're very uncomfortable with the term the people. As a matter of fact, the people kind of disgust them. They really disgust them. That's what we'll see this in a few other videos. And they certainly don't want to be rubbing elbows with the people, right? Like the Cente, like the teachers. No. See, they're not civil society for Claudio X González. Civil society is them. The white U.S.-funded NGOs, right? That's civil society, right? All of these autonomous organizations that are designed to create a simulated democracy where nothing ever really happens, right? Those are their real allies, right, in government. For them, civil society is the NGO sphere, right? The corporate NGO sphere, right? People like them, not the teachers.
No.
So what we see here in this video is some guy who's coming in, part of the Marea Rosa, the pink wave, saying very clearly that the Zócalo is ours, not those, pardon the term, not those teacher assholes, right?
Yep.
I don't know if we have the audio on that, but that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, he's basically launching vitriol, saying that
Yeah.
they can go screw themselves, but using much harsher language. We opened up the street, and then who are they to stop us from taking over the Zócalo? And saying it with a lot of pride, right? And I think this is in a lot of ways quite representative of who attended the demonstration, the Marea Rosa. I think I'm actually quite grateful that they decided to let the mask slip and make it openly partisan. Just to show who are they really? What are they like? What are their priorities? How do they express themselves? Right? They claim that they were originally there to defend, the Mexican institutions, but they're actually there to defend partisan political interests, and doing so in this manner, right? That kind of arrogance, that prepotencia. We have this other image here from Claudia X González ahead of the actual demonstration.
Oh, this is great.
Basically, trying to pressure the authorities on the scene. We're talking about rank and file police officers who have, set it up so to try to control the crowds, et cetera, and with this kind of arrogance, kind of like, no, but we're here and the media's here. Let me pass. I need to go through, right? And, because before, in previous governments, Claudia X González, he had contacts at the Secretaría de Gobernación or in the presidency. And he could go in and out and tell everybody what to do whenever he wanted. Well, that's not the case anymore. He actually has to respond to the rules that have been established for the safety of everybody, right? It is a safety concern to gather that many people in one single place, and it's totally routine. It's something that's done dozens of times over throughout the years. Is filling up the Zócalo. But what's kind of interesting is the way that he, is asking, and who are you? And what's your name? Kind of
That's
this
a
idea.
chef
Do you not
kiss
know
moment.
who I am?
Mwah. Yeah. What's your name? Claudio. Claudio who? Right? Oh, God. Mwah. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Claudio who? That one really probably stunned. And he's got to kind of fake to pretend
He
that-
wasn't making it up just to fuck with him. I mean, he just didn't know.
I think he just didn't know.
Beautiful, right? And Claudio's all offended because I'm Claudio.
Yeah, let me pull out my phone, let me call somebody, right?
Yeah.
That's not the way things work. This is the same that logic, right? These elites thinking that their opinion is the only one that matters. Their ability to occupy the Zócalo is the only one that matters. But I want to bring this other image up here on the screen from the Marea Rosa, from our friend here, Tony Huizar. This image, you actually pointed this out to me, was originally shared by the Secretaría de Gobernación. It's a drone shot from above, basically at the height of the demonstration. And guess what? They didn't quite fill the Zócalo this time.
No, they didn't.
Now, you can see a really big open space there, and that's the teacher's planton. That's the actual occupation near the flagpole in the center, and there towards the bottom right on the screen. But the rest of it, even then, is pretty sparse. And I think that's actually important. Did they get a lot of people? Sure. Yes, they did. But by being openly partisan, I think they lost some of the people who felt like maybe they actually were there to defend, and they believe this story that the institutions are at risk and therefore it's necessary. I think some of that was lost because it was obviously now a openly partisan event. But also, they're getting worn out, right? It takes effort to consistently mobilize people. They're new to this. They're new to actually demonstrating, right? And I think it speaks to the fact that there is what's the word in English? Desgaste, a wearing out.
Yep.
And I think this
Wearing out or wearing down, yeah. And it's really something too, because just 3 months ago, the former head of the INE, Lorenzo Córdoba, was up on that stage saying that this is a nonpartisan rally.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there were people, who genuinely believe that, as you said, right? And I think there is this backlash that's saying, okay, we believed you and you tricked us.
Yeah.
That's the danger of making it openly partisan like that, right? Because
I
yesterday
love-
they were handing out PAN T-shirts,
Yep.
right? They were, the panistas were there, the periodistas were there, the periodistas were there,
Oh, who's
But
who?
they were
Yeah.
still- but they were
Carlos
still-
Alarraqui, Enrique Krause, they all uploaded pictures of themselves. Laura Zapata, sort of a who's who of this opposition. But I wanted to bring back this old tweet here from the world's worst human rights defender, Emilio Álvarez y Casa. He's a senator, independent senator. This is from February. So this was before the last one that they held, when they were still pretending that it was not a partisan event. And he got so mad that somebody hung up this banner near the centro of Mexico City that talked about, we're going to go march for Xóchitl and for democracy. He lost his marbles at the time, saying, look at this with lies and a dirty campaign. They're trying to smear a citizen exercise. And yet, fast forward, May.
3 Doritos later. 3 Doritos later, literally. Yep.
Openly partisan, right? I want to jump back here because I think Tony makes some really good points here. For those of you who are active on Twitter, I recommend you follow him, Wisar Tony. He talks about this. I'll read it out to you. Lackluster opposition rally in Mexico City's main square, selling itself as nonpartisan citizens movement against dictatorship. Strange dictatorship that respects free speech and freedom of assembly. Organized by the discredited opposition parties, the NGO AstroTurf ecosystem, and the patrons of the later two, the oligarchy. Only the histrionic opposition sympathizers and the usual suspects in the international press believe the blatant untruths they are trying to sell. Mexico is not sliding into autocracy. People are more politicized and participating more than ever. Mexican institutions are not under assault. Their institutions are crumbling. The corrupt neoliberal regime is dying and lashing out against the new order. Mexico is not a narco state. Political violence obeys more complex dynamics than organized crime operating for Morena. That is the patently false narrative that they are trying to push to nullify the elections. The opposition has a hard two-thirds of the population that will not stand for the dangerous game of destabilization they are playing. Morena has the popular mandate and the truth on our side. So I think every point he makes there is really kind of succinctly brings together everything we've talked about in this episode of the program, right? We have these elites who are crafting a narrative because that narrative is necessary for them to overturn the will of the masses, of the population, as expressed through the democratic vote. That you have a media that is trying to spin this and sell these untruths to the population, that is actually lying by omission by not covering Norma Piña's disgraceful behavior and an open interference, right? This idea that the so-called guardians of the democratic transition of the early 2000s are now worried about their legacy being affected. But he's right. Their institutions, which were never that democratic in the first place, are crumbling. And they're being met with a new resurgence of mass participation, of interest in political processes by ordinary Mexicans, people who are politicized and saying, we reject this narrative that you're trying to impose on us. And I think the fact that this wearing out is very evident speaks to the fact that they're not being successful in convincing more people other than their hardliners, right? Other than that sort of solid 25% of the population that continues to, for whatever reason, support the opposition, the elites, the petty bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie that has class interests behind their support for the opposition. That's what's actually happening here in this country, right? And then all buffeted up by these, so-called analysts like Denise Dresser, who put out this information to the English-speaking world. And on that, we're going to move on to our newly renamed segment. What are we calling it now, Kurt? So we had a listener give us this tip, and I actually really like it. What should we call this segment of
our friend Luisa Martinez from the DSA has proposed that we call this the Losers and Haters Report.
So the losers and haters.
Brought to you by the DSA. Actually, it's not. But if you want to throw in a sponsorship, we'll happily take it. Right. So we've got another lovely one this week by our friend Dresser. Right, in the magazine Foreign Affairs. Right, and you can see it right from the headline. Right, Mexico's vote for autocracy. And this, I think the subtitle is actually very telling. How AMLO undermined democracy and brought back party dominance, right? Heaven forbid you have a strong political party on the left, right? That's telling. The piece itself is, one of her typical long screeds that it's not worth, going into point by point because we've debunked these points repeatedly on the program. But, she talks about this process of democratic backsliding with regards to AMLO, with regards to, the Morena party itself. She talks about the danger in this election that this isn't a right-left issue. It's a question of those who believe in democracy and those who believe in authoritarianism. This is kind of the right's desperate attempt to continue to try to frame themselves as the heroes of Mexican democracy. Something that only works for low information English language readers, and of course gullible people in Mexico. But this is Denise Dresser's real core target, right? Low information on Mexico, English language readers who are willing to swallow the argument that the elite in a country magically are going to be the people that provide mass democracy, which has never happened, ever, anywhere. But this is the magical fiction that the Dressers of the world, have tried to concoct, right? That through their own noblesse oblige, through their own, nobleness, right? Mexico's elites began to create a participative democracy throughout the 90s, leading to a democratic, in quotes, election in the year 2000, which was a managed election of one right-wing party handing over to another one, right? Followed by the vile electoral fraud of 2006, followed by the purchased election of 2012, all of these years of mass protests, mass organizing, mass movements, right, of people who didn't give up and didn't get tired, right? As José Luis pointed out, these people are already getting tired after 3 or 4, events in the Zócalo. We're talking about dozens of events over dozens of years all over the country, hundreds of events of a mass
with real
movement.
repression, right? Not this
Yeah.
imagined repression that the opposition likes to ascribe to
With
Morena.
very
Real
cool
violence.
Yeah.
Real skulls getting cracked. People being jailed. Political prisoners. People being forced into exile. Those people who actually put their necks out to establish a semblance of democracy in this country. They are the ones who actually, not the analysts who write in these columns and their screeds in foreign affairs, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So, in her reading, again, for the low information English language reader, people like Jose Woldenberg, the former head of the INE, these are the people that bestow democracy onto the masses, right? Not the Mexican public themselves that, insisted and persisted through the fraud of '88, right? Through 2 devaluations, through the drug war, through 200,000 dead and disappeared, right? Through all kinds of U.S. interference, right? Through all kinds of police brutality and barbarity, right? Through Atenco and Ayotzinapa and, all of this, laundry list of repression, Actial, Chiapas in the 90s and subsequently, right? All the history that we know. No, it was them and their comfortable sinecures in Mexico City bestowing an elite democracy on the masses. And that's what she is nostalgic for.
Yeah.
This elite democracy you talked about it. I think the good term is managed democracy, right? Others have referred to it as the Republic of Simulation, right? Mexico was the Republic of Simulation, which had, theoretical checks and balances and a series of autonomous agencies within the executive branch set up to siphon off power and, decision-making power from the executive, right? Into, the competition agency and the transparency agency and this human rights agencies, all these autonomous agencies that never did anything and collected fat salaries. And were set up so that there would never be an executive that could ever really do anything in the country. And they are beyond pissed that López Obrador saw through this, wants to get rid of, the more unproductive of these agencies, got rid of all of their trust funds, called fideicomisos, which were ways that they could carry over budgetary allotments from one year to the other and, stack up huge amounts of, of their own off-budget money to pad themselves and their own, elite lifestyles, right? And, meddle with anyone who is trying to ever change anything.
Yeah, precisely. For me, that's the key point, which is that this managed democracy, this neoliberal democratic transition, it was a means of saving the old regime.
Yeah.
It was always a conservative effort. It was not progressive in any sense. The perfect dictatorship of the PRI was in crisis, and they had to figure out a way to keep things going, lest they face an actual popular rebellion that would overturn the actually existing order in Mexico at the time. And it worked for many years. Right? It basically worked for about 20 years. That they're fooling people into thinking that this is what democracy looked like, until, like you said, somebody came along and actually showed that everything that they promised, that they said they would actually be able to deliver by democracy, didn't actually come through. And the problem is the whole system is rotten, and it needs a deep transition, right? People often in the opposition criticize the grandiose term, the fourth transformation, raising it to the level of something like the Mexican Revolution. But that's just it. That's the intention of replacing the old regime with something new, something more authentically democratic, right? And then that's why you see these kinds of, I left this on the screen here, it's quite extraordinary, right? The way that the only way to sustain that lie, or to sustain that myth, is by lie. The only way to sustain that myth is by lying. Right? By saying that Mexico's social safety net was replaced by clientelism, when actually the opposite is true. The old clientelist social safety net was replaced with a universal rights-based program, right? The Mexican president has consolidated his control of state institutions, as opposed to those same institutions that were under the control of the elite previously, right? He says that he rules with the overt support of the military, when it was the military that engaged in a massacre in 1968 to keep the PRI in power under Díaz Ordaz. That's who you're representing. It's the PRI who's backing Xóchitl Gálvez. It's the PAN that's backing Xóchitl Gálvez, right? You're the ones who actually engage in the thing that you're now trying to accuse López Obrador and Morena as being guilty of. It's extraordinary to me.
It is extraordinary. And it's funny that she, and this has been pointed out, certainly before, that she complains about creeping authoritarianism from every possible perch in the media, right? Yeah. She's on a big Televisa program, right? El Hora de Opinar. She was invited onto Channel 11, the public channel, the other night. She's all over the media. Strange authoritarian world. She's also over on Latinos, otherwise known as Letrinos, right? Which is, if there's anything that's authoritarian, it's a television station set up by Madrazo family money, right? Madrazo family dirty money. Yep. That doesn't, she's over there on the round tables, right? That doesn't seem to bother her as much. And it's funny that in this article, right, she accuses AMLO and his kids of everything under the sun. But when they talk about the accusations against Xóchitl Gálvez for being, a corrupt business person, she says, they just accuse Xóchitl Gálvez of, they accuse her of this, they accuse her of that, they accuse her of that. Didn't check and see if they were true or not, right? They accused, Maria Amparo Casar, right? As if it were all a witch hunt, as if there were nothing behind it, right? And then a little bit farther down, you can be a conservative. That's fine.
Of course.
You can, of course. You can oppose the president. You can oppose Morena. There's a lot to criticize, right? But the part where you see that Denise Dresser has no intellectual honesty is the section of the article where she talks about the number of homicides there have been under López Obrador, right? That, I don't know if you can find it. If not, I'll just summarize it, right? But there was 100 and some odd homicides under Calderón, and then, more under Peña Nieto, and then, there it is right here, right? 171,000 homicides have took place in the first 5 years of AMLO's presidency, already more than the 157,000 homicides during the administration of Peña Nieto, and the 121,000 reported under Felipe Calderón. This is just brutally, intellectually dishonest, right? Calderón started with a low level of homicides, and they spiraled upwards, getting to that 121,000, right? So, Enrique Peña Nieto started with that high number of homicides, and it went up further, right? So López Obrador inherited an annual number of homicides that was very high, and has brought the trend down. What is important is not the gross number, but the trend. Where is violence heading? Spiraled up under Calderon, I think 200%. Went up another 57% under Peña Nieto, and under AMLO, down 20%. Not enough. But they try to present the numbers here as if violence is increasing in Mexico. And this is what I talk about intellectual dishonesty. It doesn't help your argument. It doesn't help your argument to just be very fundamentally dishonest with a fundamental statistic. If you as a president inherit a high level of violence, the overall violence numbers are going to be high, even if the trend has gone down. And
Not
this
to
is
mention, López Obrador isn't on the ballot. It's Claudia Sheinbaum. And Claudia Sheinbaum did a good job bringing down homicides in Mexico City. An extraordinary effort. She's a proven track record of being
50
able to.
60%. Right?
She talked about that during the thing. She's like, let's talk about real things, right? Let's talk about real results. This is what I've been able to do, right? And I think if that's really the conversation, then why don't you engage on the merits of Claudia's proposal, right? Which is deepening the political transformation, attending to social needs, reducing the amount of young people who are have no choice but to go into organized crime, et cetera, right? There is a strategy behind this. Engage on the merits. No. López Obrador is responsible for all these deaths. It's like as if he personally went out and shot 175,000 people.
Yeah, and it's just any backhanded, underhanded argument that can serve to try to, tar AMLO and Morena I'll use, right? However misleading it is. And this is, Dr. Dresser, who you think you would know better? No. We're kind of over the hour, but I'm going to give a very quick anecdote, so consider this the bonus track. Many years ago now, Denise Dresser came to the WAPO, the Autonomous Benito Juárez University of Oaxaca, which is a public university, right? In a very poor state. Of course, she insisted on a massive honorarium, as she does, right? With all, the fancy flight and the fancy hotel and all that, right? The WAPO said, well, we don't have that money. We can pay you what was already too much. Okay? Not going to say how much it was, but it was a lot. And this, many years ago. She comes in and kind of has this attitude of kind of not wanting to touch anything because, Dresser doesn't like the masses. She's uncomfortable with the masses. This is why she said anybody who voted for Morena, well, she should go and live in Ixtapalapa, right? When she exploded on me on Twitter, for daring to call her out on that. So, she comes in to give her big show on the WAPO, right? Big pay. So somebody in the audience, she starts speaking, and somebody in the audience says, I've heard this speech before. She was simply recycling a speech. She was just giving the same speech again. For a big chunk of change.
Yeah.
Right? These people, I'm sorry, but these people are frauds. These people are frauds. To come down to a poor university in a poor state, insist on a huge amount of money to recycle a speech.
I mean, that's plagiarism. It's academic dishonesty.
Yeah.
Right? Like this isn't a speech, at some civil society group. If you're going to go to an academic space, you have to be rigorous. Yeah. And that's just it, right?
And this is why, she can't stand people like us. Because she thinks she's cornered the market on English language analysis of Mexico, recycling. This is all just one big recycle package.
Yeah.
It's all just big recycle package. Right?
Even here on the screen, we have recycled reports from Deutsche Welle, ProPublica, New York Times,
blah, blah,
right? Just regurgitating the same thing. I want to close on this, which is that we reached the end of the program. A lot of it, I think they just seem incapable of wrapping their heads around the fact that Morena is popular for a reason, right? That people's lives have been transformed, that they feel that material difference, right? And so that's why you have Movimiento Ciudadano and the opposition coalition pre-PAN presenting themselves as progressives. But the truth is, they're conservatives. They are right-wingers, right? They are interested in privileging the market over the interests of the masses. They want to make life more difficult for the working class. And why do I say that? Because
yes.
We had a very interesting piece of news happening. We talked about previously that the presidential election, pretty much from day one, looked like it was in the bag. And time has proven that correct. But the race for Mexico City was a little bit more competitive. And
Until
there was a small but
Yeah.
real possibility that the opposition could win. In fact, probably if they'd run Xóchitl Gálvez in Mexico City, they would have had an even better shot of winning, but that's a different story for another day. But what we did see is a huge own goal by the opposition coalition candidate, who again spoke at the demonstration, the Marea Rosa, on
Yep.
Sunday, where he basically made the proposal to increase fare on the poorest of this region. So Mexico City, like so many other cities, the city itself is between 9 and 10 million people, but the megapolis, the greater urban area, is almost 25 million people. And every day, millions of people come from those suburbs, those bedroom communities, which are not suburbs in sort of the North American sense. They're very low income, working class areas, and they take public transit, many different modes of public transit, to make it into the city, to go and work in the business areas, the Reformas, the Santa Fe's of Mexico City. And Santiago Taboada proposed increasing subway fares based on distance, which is something that's done in places like Paris, right? London. And it's generally criticized for being that. It's a tax on the poor. It's a tax on the people who have to travel further, who have to live further because they can't afford to live in the core. And I think served to quite reveal just why the opposition is having such a hard time. Is that they are willing to, and this wasn't a gaffe, they planned this. The PAN presented a proposal in the Mexico City Congress to introduce this type of fare structure in the middle of debate as a means to try to introduce this discussion into it, not realizing that basically what you're saying is those people who take Línea A, right, into the city, who live on the outskirts, have to pay more just to make it into their workplaces. That's a tax on the poor. They're already paying for the combi. They're already paying for the Mexibus. And then finally, the actually cheapest part of that journey is the metro, which costs only 5 cents, or 5 pesos, which is about 30 cents. And it speaks to just how out of touch their candidates are and their backers are. And it says it all. I mean, this is an article of El País. El País is not a progressive outlet, sort of center-right kind of journalism. But the headline here, the polemical debate over the subway fare that is hurting the campaign of Taboada in Mexico City. And I think, I mentioned this in a tweet, if he had a remote shot at winning,
it's gone.
it's gone.
Yeah.
This served to prove to everybody, what do they actually represent? That if they're in power, what are they going to do? They're going to make your life harder and more expensive.
And just as you said, just to close, this wasn't an off-the-cuff gaffe. They planned this. They rolled this out just weeks before the election. Thinking this is going to be a vote winner? It's extraordinary.
And so we'll see. We're very close to the election. As always, I've been your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, just joined by Kurt Hackbarth. Follow us on social media. Kurt, where can people find your work?
Jacobin Magazine, Sentido Común. I also host once a month the Arias Comunes program over at Sentido Común, and on Twitter at Kurt Hackbarth. I have put up kind of my clearinghouse for all my articles.
Excellent. Follow me at Granados Ceja on social media. And as always, like and subscribe. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to get our content out there to new listeners and viewers. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us yet again for another episode of Soberanía, the
See you next
Mexican
time.
Politics Podcast.